Hey everyone! Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest stories. In the heart of the Maasai lands, where the sun kissed the earth and the wind whispered through the tall grasses, stood a maniata, a traditional Maasai house made of mud, sticks, and cow dung. This maniata, though like any other in its construction, held a mystery within. It was the home of Niku, a woman known across the villages not only for her beauty but also for her reclusive nature. Niku was a woman of few words and fewer friends. She preferred the company of her thoughts and the solitude of her maniata. She had borne only daughters, for in total all as stunning as the first bloom of wildflowers after the rains. The villagers often whispered about her, wondering why she chose to live so alone, so removed from the vibrant life of the community. But Niku cared little for their gossip. Her world was her daughters, and she guarded them fiercely. As the years passed, Niku's daughters grew into the finest young women in the village. Their beauty was unparalleled, and their grace unmatched. It wasn't long before they became the talk of the village, admired by all who saw them. The Maasai warriors, or Marans, were particularly taken by the daughters. Every day, they found reasons to pass by the maniata, their eyes hoping to catch a glimpse of the girls, their hearts racing at the thought of winning their favor. Niku noticed the increasing interest from the Marans, and though it troubled her, she said nothing. She trusted her daughters, knowing they were as strong-willed as she was. But she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that grew each time she saw a warrior lingering too long near her home. One day, as the sun began to set and the sky turned the color of embers, Niku returned from gathering firewood. As she approached her maniata, she heard soft whispers carried on the evening breeze. Her heart quickened, and she quietly stepped around the side of the house. There, near the edge of the kraal, she saw her eldest daughter, Nazirian, speaking with a young warrior. The warrior was tall and strong, with the confidence of youth in his eyes. But what caught Niku's breath was not the sight of the two talking, it was the moment when the warrior leaned in and kissed her daughter. In that instant, something fierce and ancient stirred within Niku. She stepped forward, her presence suddenly felt by the young couple. The warrior turned, his eyes widening in fear as he saw Niku standing there, her expression as cold and unyielding as the stones beneath her feet. Before he could speak, Niku raised her hand and pointed at him, a gesture that needed no words. The warrior, trembling with fear and shame, turned and fled, disappearing into the night like a haunted animal. Nazirian, shaken, looked at her mother, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and defiance. But Niku said nothing at first. She simply lowered her hand and walked past her daughter into the maniata. After a moment of silence, she spoke, her voice as steady as the earth itself. Nazirian, my daughter, the warriors may come with promises of love, but their hearts are filled with the pride of conquest. You are more than a prize to be won. Let no warrior think he can claim you so easily. With that, Niku turned away, the matter settled in her mind. Nazirian, understanding the weight of her mother's words, nodded. From that day on, the daughters of Niku were never seen speaking with the Marans again. The warriors, though they admired the women from afar, knew better than to cross the boundary set by Niku. The following morning, as the sun began its slow ascent over the rolling plains, the young warrior who had fled the night before could not shake the image of Nazirian from his mind. Though fear had gripped him in the presence of her mother, his longing to see Nazirian again overpowered any sense of caution. Determined to win her heart, he decided to return, but this time, he would prepare himself more carefully. He began by dressing in his finest Maasai shuka, the traditional red cloth draped over his shoulder, symbolizing his strength and valor. Around his neck, he wore a beaded necklace that glistened in the morning light, each bead representing the victories and challenges he had faced as a Moran. His feet were adorned with leather sandals, worn smooth by the countless miles he had walked across the savannah. He took special care with his head, tying a strip of leather around his forehead, letting his thick, black hair fall freely behind him. As a final touch, he applied ochre to his face, a sign of his readiness for what lay ahead. With a deep breath, the warrior set out for Nazirian's Meniata. As he approached, his heart beat faster, the anticipation growing with each step. He knew the risks, but his desire to see Nazirian again was too strong to resist. When he reached the outskirts of the Meniata, he paused, scanning the area to ensure that Nico, Nazirian's mother, was nowhere in sight. Satisfied, he moved closer to the kraal where he and Nazirian had met the evening before. Standing just outside the enclosure, he let out a soft whistle, a sound that only Nazirian would recognize. Inside the Meniata, Nazirian's ears perked up at the familiar tune. Her heart leaped with joy, and without a moment's hesitation, she rushed outside. Her feet barely touched the ground as she ran toward the sound, her pulse quickening with each step. The sight of her lover standing there, waiting for her, filled her with a mix of excitement and happiness. As soon as she reached him, Nazirian threw herself into his arms, her laughter ringing out like music in the still morning air. The warrior held her close, his fears from the night before forgotten in the warmth of her embrace. They kissed, the joy of being together once more evident in their laughter and smiles. For a brief moment, it felt as if the world around them had ceased to exist, and all that mattered was the love they shared. But their moment of happiness was short-lived. Unbeknownst to them, Nico had seen them from a distance. Her sharp eyes, always watching, had caught the sight of her daughter running out of the Meniata with such urgency. She had followed, only to find the very scene she had feared, the warrior and Nazirian, lost in each other's arms. Without a word, Nico stepped forward, her presence immediately felt by the young couple. The warrior, sensing the danger, looked up and met Nico's stern gaze. His heart froze in his chest as the memory of her silent warning from the night before flashed through his mind. Panic gripped him, and once again, he pulled away from Nazirian, fear taking hold. Without a second thought, he turned and ran, his feet carrying him as fast as they could away from the Meniata. Nazirian watched him go, her heart sinking as she realized that her mother had seen everything. Nico said nothing as she approached her daughter, the weight of her silence heavy in the air. Nazirian lowered her eyes, knowing that she had defied her mother's wishes. The warrior, now just a distant figure on the horizon, had fled once more, leaving Nazirian to face the consequences alone. After the warrior fled once again, Nico stood in silence beside her daughter, her thoughts heavy with the events that had unfolded. Though she had not spoken a word, the sight of the young warrior so boldly returning to her Meniata stirred something deep within her. She knew that simply warning him off would not be enough, his desire for Nazirian would drive him back, no matter the risk. As night fell, Nico sat alone by the fire inside her Meniata, her mind turning over the situation. She could not allow the warrior to continue pursuing her daughter, yet she also knew that the young man was stubborn, driven by his infatuation. Nico considered her options carefully, and slowly, a plan began to form in her mind. She would visit the herbalist, a wise and powerful figure who lived deep in the forest, known for his knowledge of ancient remedies and curses. This herbalist was no ordinary healer. He possessed the ability to take away a man's strength, his courage, his very manhood, leaving him powerless and unable to act on his desires. Nico had heard of such things before, but never had she thought she would need to call upon such a power. Yet, for the sake of protecting her daughter, she knew this was the only way. Determined, Nico made her decision. She would seek out the herbalist and ask him to take away the warrior's manhood, ensuring that he would never again dare to approach Nazirian. The next morning, before the first light of dawn, Nico rose early. She moved quietly through the Meniata, gathering what she would need for the journey. She wrapped herself in a dark shuka, its color blending with the early morning shadows. Around her neck, she wore a necklace of beads, a token of her own strength and resolve. Niku knew the path to the herbalist's home well, for it was a journey few dared to make. The forest was thick and foreboding, its dense canopy blocking out the sun, but Niku was unafraid. As she stepped out of her manyata, the sky was still painted with the faint hues of night. The village lay silent, its inhabitants still lost in sleep. Niku moved with purpose, her footsteps sure and steady as she left the familiar paths behind and entered the dark embrace of the forest. The trees towered above her, their ancient branches twisting and turning like the arms of forgotten spirits. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy scent of moss and wet leaves. Niku's eyes adjusted to the dim light as she navigated the narrow trails that wound deeper into the heart of the forest. She knew this journey was not just one of distance but of resolve, her commitment to protecting her daughter from the dangers of the outside world. After hours of walking, with the morning light barely filtering through the thick canopy above, Niku finally reached the edge of a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a small, weathered hut, its walls covered in vines and its roof made of dry grass. This was the home of the herbalist, the place where Niku would find the solution to her troubles. She paused for a moment at the edge of the clearing, taking a deep breath before stepping forward. The forest around her was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Niku approached the hut, her heart steady with the decision she had made. As she reached the doorway, she hesitated for a brief moment, then lifted her hand and knocked on the wooden door. The sound echoed through the clearing, and after a pause, the door slowly creaked open, revealing the herbalist standing within. His eyes, sharp and knowing, met Niku's with a gaze that seemed to pierce through her. Without a word, Niku stepped inside, ready to explain her request and to do whatever was necessary to protect her daughter from the warrior who had dared to defy her. As Niku stepped inside the herbalist's dimly lit hut, the air around her seemed thick with the scent of herbs and smoke. The interior was cluttered with bundles of dried plants hanging from the ceiling, shelves lined with jars of mysterious powders, and an assortment of bones and stones scattered across a low wooden table. The herbalist, an old man with deep lines etched into his weathered face, stood silently, waiting for Niku to speak. With a steady voice, Niku explained her purpose. "I have come to you, wise one, seeking your help. There is a young warrior who has taken an interest in my daughter, Nazirian. He has defied my warnings and returned after I made it clear that he should stay away. I fear that he will not stop until he has her. I need you to take away his strength, his manhood, so that he will no longer have the courage or desire to approach her again." The herbalist listened intently, his eyes narrowing as he considered her request. After a moment, he nodded and gestured for Niku to sit on a woven mat beside the fire pit. He moved slowly, deliberately, as he reached for a large, ornate mirror that hung on the wall. The mirror was unlike any other. Its surface was not made of glass but of polished metal, dull and dark, as if it had absorbed the shadows of the many rituals it had witnessed over the years. The herbalist placed the mirror on the ground between them, then began to chant softly, his voice a low murmur that seemed to resonate with the very walls of the hut. He called out the name of the warrior, repeating it over and over, his tone growing more intense with each repetition. The flames in the fire pit flickered and danced as if responding to his incantations. Niku watched as the surface of the mirror began to shift and swirl, the dark metal reflecting something that wasn't quite there. Slowly, an image began to form, faint at first but growing clearer with each passing moment. The face of the warrior appeared, his expression one of confusion and fear, as if he could sense that he was being watched. The herbalist stopped chanting and looked at Niku, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. "Is this the man?" he asked, his voice echoing in the small space. Niku leaned forward, her breath catching as she recognized the young warrior's face in the mirror. She nodded firmly, her voice steady as she replied, "Yes, that is the one." With a satisfied nod, the herbalist set the mirror aside and reached for a small pouch made of animal hide. He emptied its contents onto the table, a collection of bones, each one small and intricately carved with symbols and runes that seemed to pulsate with ancient power. He took the bones in his hands, closed his eyes, and began to whisper another incantation, his fingers moving deftly over the surface of the bones. Then, with a sudden, swift motion, he threw the bones into the air. They scattered across the table and floor, each one landing in a precise pattern that only the herbalist could decipher. He studied the arrangement carefully, his eyes narrowing as he interpreted their meaning. The room seemed to hum with energy as the herbalist began the final phase of his ritual. He picked up one of the larger bones and held it over the fire, chanting louder now, his voice filling the room. As the bone heated, he held it above the mirror, allowing a single drop of liquid to fall onto the warrior's image. The moment the drop touched the surface, the warrior's face twisted in pain, his eyes wide with terror. The herbalist continued his ritual, his movements precise and deliberate, until finally, he threw the remaining bones up and down in a series of rhythmic motions, each throw accompanied by a powerful chant. The air around them grew heavy, the fire crackling and flaring as the energy in the room reached its peak. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the ritual ended. The herbalist let out a long breath, his body relaxing as the tension in the room dissipated. The mirror surface returned to its dull, lifeless state, the image of the warrior gone. "It is done," the herbalist said, his voice calm and assured. "The young warrior will no longer have the strength or desire to pursue your daughter. He will remember this day in his bones and will not dare to defy you again." Niku nodded, her heart filled with a mix of relief and gratitude. She knew the power of the herbalist's rituals, and she trusted that the warrior would be deterred. She stood, thanking the herbalist with a deep bow before turning to leave the hut. As she stepped back into the forest, the light of day slowly filtering through the trees, Niku felt a sense of peace. She knew that she had done what was necessary to protect her daughter, and with the herbalist's help, she had ensured that the young warrior would trouble them no more. As Niku made her way back through the forest, the village began to stir with the sounds of early morning life. The young warrior, who had spent the previous night thinking of Nazirian, suddenly awoke to a sharp, searing pain in his manhood. He doubled over, clutching himself, his face contorted in agony. "You, my manhood. I'm dying," he cried out, his voice filled with fear and desperation. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, as if something inside him was tearing apart. Staggering out of his hut, he continued to shout, his cries echoing through the village and waking everyone from their sleep. The villagers, alarmed by the sound of his screams, rushed to his side, their faces filled with concern and confusion. They found him on the ground, writhing in pain, his hands desperately clutching his manhood as he pleaded for help. "What is happening?" one of the elders asked, kneeling beside him. "What has caused this pain?" "I don't know," the warrior gasped. "It came out of nowhere. I feel as if something is burning inside me. You, please help me." The villagers gathered around, trying to comfort him. Some offered water, others murmured prayers, but nothing seemed to ease his suffering. His once strong body was now trembling, his eyes wide with panic as the pain intensified. The elder, sensing that something unnatural was at play, looked around at the others. "This is not an ordinary illness," he said gravely. "We must call the healer." As the villagers hurried to find the healer, the warrior's cries continued to fill the air, a haunting sound that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. They knew they had to act quickly, but as they gathered around the young warrior, desperately trying to find a way to help him,